Okay, great. Good evening, and welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. It is my great pleasure to actually be at Mitchell Innes and Nash Gallery in Chelsea, here with Lucy Mitchell Innes and Lee Hallman, presenting Leon Kossoff, A Life in Painting. Before we begin, I would just like to thank all those that helped make this presentation possible. The New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported by an award from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors. We are extremely grateful for all of the contributions that help bring this programming to be, and if at all during or after tonight's talk you feel so inclined, please consider making a donation through the Studio School's website at www.nyss.org. Yes, it's a very thrilling event indeed. I want to personally thank Lucy Mitchell Innes for allowing us to do this. I think it's an amazing opportunity to look at Leon Kossoff's paintings. Someone greatly admired at the Studio School. So I will introduce our speakers, and then we'll show a couple slides and then begin our walk around of the gallery. All right. Lee Hallman is a Texas-based writer and curator. She holds a Ph.D. from the City University of New York Graduate Center, where she completed a dissertation on the post-war London landscape paintings of Frank Auerbach and Leon Kossoff. As Associate Curator of the the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth from 2017 to 2021, she was the organizing curator of David Park, a retrospective, and edited Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth collection highlights. Lucy Mitchell Innes co-founded Mitchell Innes and Nash in 1996 with her husband, David Nash, with the gallery then on Madison Avenue. In 2005, Mitchell Innes and Nash opened a second space in New York's Chelsea neighborhood. And it truly is an honor to be here, being able to present this through the New York Studio School's Evening Lecture Series. And please join me in a virtual welcome for Lucy Mitchell Innes and Lee Hallman.
I'm going to spend a few minutes speaking a little bit about Leon's background. Leon was born in London in 1926. At the end of 1926, he was the second of 7 children born to Wolf Kossoff, who came from a small town outside of Kiev in what was then Imperial Russia. Leon's grandfather came from Kiev in about 1905, and his son Wolf joined him in 1908 in London, where he worked selling bread. In other words, starting absolutely nothing. By the mid-teens, he earned enough money to get a horse and cart to distribute bread. And in 1917, he was able to join the Russian army and go and fight in the wars against the imperial regime. He became embroiled in the revolution and was imprisoned, escaped to Romania, and eventually found his way back to London, where he settled and stayed and remarried. And in 1925, his first child was born, and then Leon in 1926. They were born in and lived in the East End of London, in an area which was very common for immigrants to move into and live in. And he lived in and around Carmel Circus, which we'll come back to a little later, as an area of London, a little later in this discussion. I'll come back to some more biographical details. I mean, a little bit, by the time he was, I suppose, 15, 14, 15, the Second World War broke out in London, and all of the children from the school that he attended were evacuated from London. All children were evacuated from London, and he was sent to Norfolk, which is about 2 hours north of London, where he spent the next 3.5 years with his brother, who was also evacuated. Oddly enough, they did return to London during the school vacations. And in 1943, he returned to London permanently. It was while he was evacuated that he saw in the library of King's Lynn paintings by English 19th century painters such as Kossoff, and was encouraged in his interest in art by the family he was evacuated out to live with during the 4 years. When he came back in 1943, in 1946, he joined up in the army and was stationed in Italy, and then later in northern Germany and Holland, I think, before being demobbed in the late 40s. And that's when he really started to study art in a number of different schools in and around London. And I think we're looking here at a self-portrait. Lee and I thought it would be interesting to start with a view of the studio and then a self-portrait. The view of the studio shows Leon, I think the early 70s.
That's the one that was just on the screen.
Yes.
The black and white picture of him in the studio. Yeah.
And this is a self-portrait where he's looking over his shoulder into a mirror, which is a traditional way that self-portraits were painted. And in the background, you can see one of the very famous Nicholas Hawksmoor Church, the Littlefield, which again we'll see later. This is a series of paintings that he painted in the 80s, and it was very symbolic of his early life in London. These churches were scattered all over the east end of London. They were built in the 17th century after the Great Fire of London by Hawksmoor and Crystal Wren and a number of other architects.
This is an interesting one to start with, I think, because it's an unusual painting in that it combines a portrait with a building. I don't know of any others that do that. And those are really Kossoff's two main subjects are portraits, which include self-portraits and portraits of his close friends and family members and a few long-term models. And then his second main subject is London, which he started painting as a student. He and Frank Auerbach, who were very close at that time, who were classmates, would go out into London, into the streets when the city was being rebuilt after the Second World War. It was the time of great building projects, and they found these construction sites enormously exciting, and then they would go and draw them. And so that was sort of the beginning of his, I think, love affair with drawing London. And he continued to go out into the city and paint sites that were meaningful to him for the rest of his life. So this church, Christ Church, is one that goes back to his childhood that we'll come back to at the end.
Should we go on? Sure. Yeah. this is the earliest painting in the exhibition. It is from 1963. It's one of 2 or 3 years large-scale music painted period that were widely endorsed by critics at the time. It is extremely thickly painted. I don't know how clearly you can see this, but the paint is inches thick into the surface.
He painted on boards because his process was so intense that there's no way a canvas would have been able to stand up to the amount of material he put on it and how heavily he worked it. And he, from early on, his process involved drawing the subject in the studio. So the sitter would come and he would draw them and draw them and draw them, and then he would paint them later from memory, using the drawings as sort of to jog his memory. But so what you see here was painted in a single day. So he would come back to the same subject and he would paint it, and if he wasn't satisfied with it, he would destroy it. He would scrape all the paint off onto the floor and then start again the next day. I mean, I can't even imagine how much paint he went through on a weekly basis, but in this work, you can see just, I mean, like Lucy said, the painting is inches thick, and you can even see places where the outer membrane is sort of split in the drying process. You know, these things take years, if not decades, to fully dry. But to me, it's a really great example of his early portraiture. I mean, it's an intensely abstract portrayal of a figure because he wasn't going for resemblance or likeness. He was trying to capture the presence of the human form in front of him. He was trying to capture some essence of that person and their encounter. And so what you have here is this figure emerging out of this roiling surface of paint. And there's a great tension in his work always between the materiality and the image, and they're kind of battling against each other. And the process of looking is such that you find yourself seeing the image emerge slowly.
I'm just going to emphasize the paint. He laid these boards flat to dry, and on occasion when they were stood up, the paint quite simply, because it was so thick, slid right down. So you get this fold, or you'll get an opening where the paint is just slid the whole way down through the canvas. And this was part of the process. And if Leon didn't like it, he would scrape it all off. And by this stage, he had the recommendation of, from the early 50s actually, of a fellow student at art school. He had been recommended to a manufacturer of paints in Sheffield called Stokes. And he used Stokes paint along with Auerbach, Frank Auerbach, who was a very, very close friend and a little younger than him, but they were at art school together. Both, Leon was born in the UK, but Frank was on one of the kinder transports from Germany to England in the late 30s. And they were at art school together in the 50s. They were very close, drew a lot together. And they both had been recommended to Stokes paint in Sheffield. And Leon used Stokes paint throughout his working career, right up until around about 2000, 2005, when it went out of business. Shall we move on to look at some of the portraits, and we can talk a little bit about. This is a portrait of here, Leon's father. There are a number of portraits here. typically Leon would have sitters come to the studio, and he would draw them. And that would start very early in the morning. He would prepare himself at 6, and at 7 the sitters would come, and he would draw for about three hours. And it was very, very important to him, the whole process of drawing and multiple drawings, until he really, really felt he knew the subject. He would also do that when he was painting London landscapes, in situ drawing. The painting itself was always done back at the studio, and that was generally done in the afternoon, the second half of the day. So we're looking here at a portrait from the 80s of Leon's father, Wolf, after he had retired. And I think you can see the intensity of, there are two things to see here. One is the intensity of his father's personality, his relationship with his father, and how he has mastered the paint over the decade between, sort of a decade and a half between these two paintings.
Yeah, and it's nice having this mini retrospective here, because you can really see through the years how his paint, his palette changes and his handling of paint changes. I mean, his works are always thickly painted and incredibly gestural and activated, but the one we were looking at a minute ago, I mean, it was deep earth tones and dark colors, and but yet you start to see color emerging from light. Painting just, like Nancy said, just really brings home the intensity of his relationship with his father. Over life-size figure, great gravitas. I mean, it reminds me, you know, the old master portrait paintings of statesmen and kings. But this is his father, and he paints him, you know, over the decades throughout his life, and he paints his family members many times over.
And here we have this is a very, very close family friend. So an artist, John Rousseau, who sat, whose mother had been Leon's first gallerist in the late 50s, the Beaux-Arts Gallery. And John is a very, very close friend and sat for Leon from really from the, I think the 60s onwards, right up until the end of Leon's life. And in fact, John was at the opening of this exhibition in London in September. So,
yeah, his mother, the gallerist, gave Leon and Frank Auerbach, among other British artists, their first exhibition. She was a really important figure in the mid 20th century British art scene, and yeah, and Kossoff maintained a lifelong friendship with John.
Continuing along this wall here, very large scale portrait from 1973. The father was from 1972, but this is 1973. This is a portrait of Rosalind #1. Rosalind, also known as Peggy to all of us, is Leon's wife and widow. They met and were married in 1954, and she and their only child was born in 1955, that's David, and she sat for him from the early 50s, from 53, 54, right up until 2012 or 13. So she was one of the longest serving models. And,
Sure. I think what's always amazing to me is that these paintings are so rapidly done and so activated. I mean, the surface, if you can get close to it, I mean, it's got these flying ribbons of paint. I mean, it was an incredibly athletic feat to paint these portraits, and they happened, you know, in the course of an afternoon. But at the same time, you know, their genesis was incredibly slow and encompassing, you know, his entire relationship with his wife here. I mean, everything feeds into this portrait. I mean, his intimate knowledge of her, and somehow in just a few brush strokes, he's able to capture her features. And it's a very tender portrait of her. You know, she looks just sort of relaxed in their home. And you can see, and Kossoff always, drawing was essential to his practice, not only making drawings on paper, but the act of drawing in paint. So this is a good example, I think, of how, I mean, you can see how he lays down, you know, this thick field of paint, but then goes in and almost draws out the features of his wife, you know, again, with just a few strokes. So you see, again, you know, you're able to see the image sort of coming forth through drawing in paint.
as he's painting very fast and very vigorously, the paint, the skeins of paint are dripping all the way down to the surface. So this ochre color that he's painting with drips down on the surface in a very vigorous way, and that is absolutely characteristic of all of these paintings, really throughout his career.
Yeah, I mean, up close, it's like looking at a Pollock or something. I mean, it's just incredibly activated and just, yeah, especially got paint skeins, like he's just flinging it all over, and yet the image coheres out of this. So,
And we can move on to look at another portrait of Leon's father asleep. Again, this would have been a drawing which came, which was done in the studio early in the morning, and they sat for 3 hours with a 1 hour break, and not unusual for a model to nod off every now and again. Again, you can see the thickness. You can see here some of the details where the paint is mixed with, typically what he would do when he'd get the paint from Stokes, he'd take the oil out of the can, the oil had floated to the top, he'd remove that. That was sort of saturated with a newspaper on the floor. And then there's a certain amount of medium which is mixed in, which you can see how it's floated to the surface of the paint strokes and slightly discolored over.
Are we able to show the slides of his studio? We had a couple of pictures, actually of his paint tins and just how the studio looked. Go on to the next one.
Okay. Yes. So these are some photographs actually I took years ago. You can see here it says Stokes paint. This is a sort of tool. It's not a paintbrush anymore. It's just a tool.
It's like everything is just encrusted. It becomes sort of this like crustacean landscape in there. Just you can see paint all over the floor, and his studio was the front room of his house. I mean, he had a few studios elsewhere earlier in his career, but after a point, he just used this room in his house. And I mean, he had special pairs of shoes that his wife insisted that he wear when he was in that room, and then, he was not allowed to enter the rest of the home. But
is there another We can just continue.
Yeah, we could go on to the next slide.
This is a portrait of, on the right of our screen is his mother, and on the left is another portrait, a very early portrait from the very early 60s of his father, also asleep in a chair. These are big monumental paintings, and I think speak to the really the monumentality of his mother and both of them in his life. If we can just continue on, I think we might see some more studio shots.
Yeah, go to the next slide. So this is an example of one of his earliest London paintings. This is the Shell building site. What's the year of this? 19?
This is, I think it's actually the end of the series. I think it's early 60s.
Early 60s. So yeah, and this is a quintessential example of his building site paintings, looking into this huge area of upheaval as, a tower's going up. And even though it's incredibly abstracted, but what's remarkable is that he's actually able to capture an amazing amount of detail. And again, you really have to spend time looking at these to see the image kind of emerging out. You've got this tower going up in the middle, and are we okay?
Keep going.
Anyway,
we could just move on and look at this, which is the demolition of the YMCA.
She's still screen sharing. So, okay.
It's just rotate. So this is a painting from 10 years later from the one you just saw on the screen. It's the early 70s. And it was a demolition of the YMCA, which was up near Bloomsbury, near King's Cross and Charing Cross, King's Cross Station in London. And
he was teaching at the time at St. Martin's School, so he would pass by this site. And I think he was sad to see this building torn down that he admired, but at the same time, again, he was kind of just visually really stimulated by the demolition process. So, rather than a construction site, this is a destruction site, but he still, what interests him is just the human activity of these scenes. I think the idea of transformation, of matter from one thing to another, got what was a building coming down. And again, you can make out little figures sort of in the mire of all this paint. You've got, workmen pulling sort of dirt along or building materials. You've got a crane going up on the left side. And then you get this cityscape background along the top. You see one of those, I don't know which church that is, but it's one of those classic Hawksmoor era churches. So even as abstract as it is, it's actually a really factual record at the same time of the transformation of this place in London.
so these paintings were made from drawings which he would have done on site in London, often in very, very adverse conditions, weather, cold, rain, a lot of that. And it's back in the studio that the painting was executed, and painted very fast, and then again,
Yeah.
often.
I mean, he'd make dozens of drawings of the subject. I mean, he'd go back day after day and capture it, you know, at different moments and at different weathers, and somehow, but it was in the studio when he was working on the painting that somehow all of these drawings were synthesized, all of this information somehow becomes synthesized in a coherent image. And, you know, when it felt true to him, that's when he knew it was finished. You know, it might take weeks or months.
We have a screen photograph
Yeah.
of the drawings in the studio,
Yeah.
which I think at this point might be worth looking at.
Yeah.
They're in the.
Yeah, there's a slide of a wall of drawings.
There you
Yeah.
go. That's a. So this is a different site, actually not very far from this one. This was when one of the stations was being redeveloped in London, much more recently in the 90s. And he actually rented a space from an unoccupied building where he could look down on this site and make those drawings. And as you can see, he drew, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens until he felt completely that he really knew the subject before he went back to paint it in a big, large-scale painting.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, he'd pin up, you know, a selection of these drawings on the wall in the studio while he was working on the painting, just to remind him of everything that he recorded when he was there on site.
So I think we'll go to the Poussin.
Okay.
So another great passion of Leon's was to study the old masters, and including Rembrandt, Goya, and here Poussin. And when there were periodic exhibitions which would come through London, either at the Royal Academy or the National Gallery or other museums, he would go and have access to these museums very, very early in the morning before anybody was there, again around 7 o'clock in the morning. And he would draw in front of certain paintings that really interested him for the subject and the structure. And it's admiration of, in this case, the Poussin. And then he would go back to the studio and he executed a series of paintings. And
Yeah, and he did several works after Poussin paintings, and this is one that really seemed to capture his imagination. We have a slide of the original painting that would be good to put up just for context. If we could look at that for a second. Yep. So it's this painting's from about 1630, I believe, and it's a depiction of a story that Ovid tells in the Metamorphosis. Aurora is the goddess of dawn, and she fell in love with a mortal man, Cephalus. And Poussin depicts this moment where she is clinging on to him and he is turning away. And the Cupid figure is holding up a picture of his wife. And in this moment, he realizes, you know, that he wants to be with his wife. And so it's this rather dramatic, you know, sort of story of love and heartbreak. And you've got a reclining river god there on the left, and Pegasus, the horse, in the background. So I think, you know, my sense is that what Kossoff, I mean, it was not just the subject matter and sort of the dramatic intensity that he was responding to, but, you know, just Poussin's composition and the way that he captures just this dynamic figural arrangement. And you've got this group of figures going across the canvas, turning in different ways. And, you know, Poussin is known for his, you know, classical stillness, but when Kossoff, he does his translation, you know, it becomes an entirely different thing. So he sort of reduces a lot of the detail out, but yet he still captures these figures, but in his own thick painterly style.
He's in some ways, you could say, taken artistic license from Poussin. This very dark element, diagonal element, which moves everything into the painting, has been emphasized by Leon. And then Pegasus is very static, so it's come, stops the eye from moving, as is Cupid. And then the river, I thought this is a series of horizontals. As Lee said, Poussin is about structure, stillness, and this is about movement and emotion. And a nice little aside is this particular painting was hanging in Leon's front hall for 25 years, ever since I knew him. It was always hanging there. So it's had a special place in his heart. He would have been, he would very much wanted to see the Poussin exhibition. It's in London in September, October, and it's now at the Getty. The show that's in Los Angeles has 2 or 3 more Poussin paintings because of the connection.
Yeah, move on to the last group of works, which are London paintings. This is a street scene, the date's 1983 when he painted this, and this is a street near his home in Willesden. And most of the places that he painted, with a few exceptions, were within maybe a mile radius of the studio. There were everyday places that he knew intimately on his daily routine. That was the London that interested him. It wasn't the landmarks. It wasn't, the sort of great ceremonial buildings. It was these ordinary neighborhood scenes, because that was his London, and he liked, he was just excited by the everyday commotion and the movement of people. He did this whole series of underground train stations because he just loved seeing just Londoners in their daily lives. And so this is just sort of an ordinary street near where he lived, a sort of shopping street. And you've got people sort of walking down. There's a woman on a bench. There's a line of shops there, and you've got this couple with their arm around each other. So he, these are things that he would have witnessed and drawn. And then when he came back to paint it, it just sort of stood out to him as really touching moments. And again, just the surface here is just incredibly interesting. I mean, they're just ribbons of paint throughout.
There are 2 things I think that have well, one thing I think you can't miss is this is called A Street Scene, Early Summer. And you can see that there's a lightness. The London light changes in summer, the days get much longer, and everything is green, and the lightness is in the paint. It's lighter, this activity, and it has a summery feel. And then the other thing I've noticed only by having these 2 paintings adjacent to each other is that that they're a year apart or 2 years apart. The structure of the Poussin painting and his intensive study of Poussin seems to have carried over into this London, the scene, the people, the way he uses people to structure the composition, and he uses the trees and architecture. And he really, as I say, he spent his whole life studying the artists about whom he felt very strongly, and Poussin was for sure one of them. And then we go even closer to home. This painting, the next painting we're going to look at, which is called Between Kilburn and Willesden Green, Winter Evening. And actually this railway line ran across the bottom of his garden, in Peggy's garden, backed onto the railway line that came in through North London. And so he drew and then of course painted. Here comes, there's actually a painting called Here Comes the Diesel, but here actually does come the diesel. And another railway, two different types of trains, and the sort of rather wintry, leafless trees, which have appeared now, replacing the light summery colors of the previous painting.
Yeah, so this is capturing his own back garden. It's as close to home as you can get. And he was especially fascinated by railways. They're a subject that comes in and out of his work. He painted railway stations, underground stations, and then the actual trains on tracks. And there's this amazing series of paintings of Willesden Junction that's not in this exhibition, but something about the tracks themselves. And he described London when he talked about it as a living body. And the train tracks were like the circulatory system. They were what carried the Londoners throughout the body of the city. And there's one quote that I've seen repeated by him many times because it's so good. And he said, for me, London's in my bloodstream. He really just felt like it was part of him and he was part of it. So.
So this is called the Red Brick School Building. Winter, so in case you have any doubt, it's not somewhere here. These red brick buildings are the classic school buildings that were built in the late 19th and very, very early 20th century to ensure education for children throughout England and London. So you see these buildings pretty commonly around a good deal of London from the very late 19th century. He himself attended a school like this in his very early years before he was evacuated out. So it's been suggested that in his mind there was the association with his early childhood and London and these red brick buildings. And of course you see the London taxi here and people moving to and from in front of the school. What he did, which is quite unusual, and I have to read this evening, is that he bought himself an old car and he parked the car in front of the school and did the drawings from the car in front of the school because it was winter and it was cold. And that became his mobile studio. Well, this particular school building, which I think was called Dodson School. So that's how he did this, and this is the only time I didn't even know Leon drove, let alone owned a car. So, and again, here the size of the building, the huge scale of the building in relation to the people, I think is interesting.
Yeah, and there was something about these red brick school buildings that was just sort of very important to him. I mean, they are sort of everyday Victorian buildings, but they were built to sort of have a kind of a majestic presence. And it did resonate, I think, with the school that he went to as a child. So just the scale of it and how it's sort of rising up into the sky. It's he gives it a significance that you may not notice if you were just walking down the street.
You can't quite see it, I don't think, here, but he kind of bookends this structure with two very strong strokes of blue paint. So it's contained and vertical. So this is the last painting we're going to be looking at this evening in this series. It's from 1992. It's called Christchurch, Spitalfields, Early Summer. Spitalfields, again, it's in East London, where he was born and spent his early years. And he would have passed this kind of structure, these kind of big white neoclassical churches that again were built after the Fire of London, which was in 1666. And you can see again the lightness of the color is, you know it's early summer. It's not like the tree and leaf. And,
but this building made a huge impression on him when he was a child. I mean, he lived not far from it, and he's described, his memories of growing up in the East End, when there were still horses and carts along with cars and fruit and vegetable sellers on the street and the sound of the church bells. And this particular church by Hawksmoor is, it's a really strange building. It's tall and narrow, and he's stacked these different elements on top of each other. So even though it's not actually a huge building, it has a massive presence. And for a young Jewish boy, I think there was something sort of terrifying and wonderful about it. And I think he always wanted to draw and paint it, and he tried several times when he was younger. But it wasn't until I think the 1980s that he finally felt ready to sort of tackle it as a subject. And then he has this wonderful series that, lasts 15 years or so, capturing it. Again, he has summer paintings and winter paintings and overcast paintings but always you have, the Londoners in the foreground, showing that this historic building is still just part of this landscape that everyday Londoners pass through. And one interesting thing to mention is when he would go to the sites and draw, he would include people, but when it came to painting these paintings in the studio, when he was sort of synthesizing all this information, unconsciously he would find himself actually including portraits of people he knew, like his family and his models. He would just find himself painting them as these people. So sometimes you see his father, sometimes you see Peggy, sometimes you see Fidelma.
And then lastly, maybe let's share some details of this. We'll end on another self-portrait, just a very small painting. Really fixed painted.
I don't know if you can get a shot of it from the side just to show what these boards look like after we finish with them. I mean, it's just crusted on, and you can see the remnants of every attempt of painting he made. All of those paintings live beneath what becomes the final image.
So that's the content of this exhibition. Are there any questions that anybody? Come back with?
Okay. So we're just, thanks everyone. I know we have a lot of comments, and I want to thank everybody. I think we had a little bit of sound issues in the beginning. And that's, but we really appreciate everyone. I'm going to give like a very quick little clap because I think really, it's been very special to be here at the gallery, looking at these paintings as Lucy and Lee were speaking. So please do put a question in either the chat or Q&A, and I will do my best to get to as many as we can. I doubt it, but David Benzian is asking, was the rest of his house as messy as his studio?
No, absolutely not. Upstairs, it was extremely neat. Downstairs was the studio and various rooms that he used for drying the paintings, which is a long process. And then upstairs is the apartment.
Amy Brown Price, she says, his work is turgid and tumultuous, but the colors muted and neutered and grayed often. How does this express his upbringing? Surely deeply.
Well, I think I would encourage the person asking this question come to see the exhibition, because I think you can see much better the range of color. And the colors, I mean, he looked at a lot of British painters, Constable, British landscape painters. And if you look at British landscape painting, the light was always changing. It was always changing from, you know, dark and stormy to light and sunlight. It's a you know, a huge factor in landscape painting in London and England. So although it might look dark and turgid, I think that you'd see a lot more.
I mean, I can understand why a lot of people on first impression think the work looks gloomy, and he's, you know, often been described as this, you know, sort of painter of gloomy London. But I think even though you do get stormy scenes, of course, and even though the paint can be quite turgid, the feeling of these pictures is really one of celebration. I mean, I think this was a deeply feeling person who really loved his subject matter, and I just think the intensity of emotion in them, they're sort of very heartfelt and celebratory in spite of, you know, how they may look at first glance.
Janice is asking, could he have been inspired by Romance buildings? Are there other artists that he, other than who you mentioned, Constable, Rosalind, and then this is an interesting question: who owns this work?
Well, some of this work is privately owned now. Much of it is in museums and institutions all over the world. A lot of it is in British institutions. And he was inspired. Other artists he looked at a lot were Rembrandt. Monet, yes, he's certainly aware it's Cézanne. I mean, Cézanne and Poussin, what he's looking for is the structure you see in his paintings. I mean, Cézanne, so he had a pin up in the studio of a picture of Cézanne's Monceau Victoire, which the paintings are made right at the end of his life in the south of France. And, you know, it's this mountain, the structure of the mountain, and you could relate that directly to the YWMCA painting.
I think you can draw a parallel to Monet in that he, you know, painted the same subject in many different weathers and light conditions, but I would draw a contrast. I mean, whereas Monet, I think it was the visual effects of light and the transient moment that he was really interested in. For Kossoff, I mean, his attachment to the subject was a much deeper thing.
David Bomberg, he studied under David Bomberg in London in the early 50s at the sort of recommendation of Auerbach. They both did, and Bomberg was influenced by German expressionism. So I think that's where you see it's very emotional surfaces to the painting that comes from German expressions.
Did he speak about his relationship to Bomberg later in life?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he and Frank Auerbach, when I spoke to them about it, I mean, to them, it was more even than Bomberg's art. It was his character, as a person, as a teacher. He really, I think, encouraged his students to be totally uncompromising when it came to their art, to be, you know, truthful. And I mean, he really had an ethical sense of what it meant to be an artist that I think was really important to Kossoff.
Irene is asking, did he intentionally mix the colors he used, or did they happen because of the layers and layers of paint scraping?
I think that they were intentional. You can see here that he goes from the portrait of Peggy, Rosalind. Yes, you know, it's a different palette from some of the later paintings, or much stronger color in that. So I think he definitely had a hand in what color he did.
I mean, as I understand it, he mixed his colors as he was painting. You know, it wasn't something that he determined sort of in any kind of conscious way beforehand. It just sort of happened instinctively in the act of painting.
Paula is wondering what specifically what Lucian Freud may have thought of his work and vice versa. I would just expand that, you know, to some of his other peers, like conversations he had with Auerbach or Hockney and anyone from that group.
Well, he was very close to Auerbach, particularly for quite a few years, and they hugely admired each other's work. I mean, they were, I think they really encouraged each other as students, and they had a lifelong admiration, you know, whatever happened to their, you know, personal relationship over the years. And Freud, I think, going back to what I was talking about a moment ago about, I think Freud even admitted that at first he found the paintings, you know, rather sort of gloomy and heavy, but then the more he looked, the more he realized that, you know, these are paintings based in deep feeling and emotion, and they're really, you know, again, celebrations of the people he loved and the city he loved.
This question is again from Paula. She's wondering, she says, his drawings are so spontaneous and rich, as are his paintings. Did he ever present his sketches or drawings as finished works in the galleries? And she mentions that she doesn't think that he thought of himself as a draftsman. I wonder if you could speak. Maybe.
Yes, He did. Oh, yes. The drawing was a tremendous report. And yes, we had several exhibitions. And there are catalogues here at the gallery. It's very welcome to come by.
I think drawing was something he had to work at and had to practice his whole life. I mean, I think he admitted that he wasn't necessarily the most natural draftsman, but he said at one point, I have to teach myself to draw again every day.
And that in itself is incredible for someone. Good, you know. Okay, I think that might be. I'm doing my best to see all the questions. So I think we've gone to them all. It's a fantastic show. Really hope if you're in New York, you have the chance to come to 26th Street to the gallery and see it in person. When is the closing?
It closes a week from Saturday. It's on another 10 days.
So it's up
I would say the 5th of
March.
Yes.
So I really hope you can come and see it in person. And maybe this question from Audrey might be a good way to sort of to end the webinar. She's asking just that if you could expand a bit more on the concept of drawing with paint as opposed to simply painting. Yes.
I'll give a stab at it. I mean, drawing, I think the essence of drawing is line. And some paintings, some painters work in a way that they try to erase all lines because they're trying to, capture a form in space. But Kossoff really carried the strong line of his drawings into the paintings. And I think that is how finally he defines the image. Again, the sort of great tension that makes his work so exciting is between the materiality of the paint and the integrity of this image. And I think it's really through drawing in paint. So making strong lines, gestures, capturing the facial features of someone he knew so well in just a few strokes. You get the strong, portrait of his father. This network of lines that he would have rehearsed over and over and over again when he was drawing his father day after day. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Okay, well, thank you, Lee, and thank you, Lucy. This has been an extraordinary opportunity for us at the Studio School, and I hope, and we're just extremely grateful. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. And again, I know we had a little bit of audio difficulties in the beginning, but we still got to look at these amazing paintings pretty close up. So I'll leave the last word to both of you, but thank you all. Thank you for joining us. There's a lot of great comments coming in here, so we really appreciate it. Any final?
Come see the exhibition.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Sorry, I was inaudible.